So hello, I'm Henry Dietz, the director of Kunstverein Freiburg, and I would like to welcome you to our online event titled Queer Abstraction. And this event is part of our public program of Ester Fleckner's solo exhibition, Slow Tools, which is still running at Kunstverein Freiburg till the 29th of October. And I would like to welcome Lex Morgan Lancaster, our speaker, who's joining us from New York. So welcome, Lex, and a warm welcome to Ester Fleckner, who's joining us from Mohn. And Mohn, for those who don't know it, because I really like this detail, it's an island in the Baltic Sea. And at some point, I hope that I will manage to go there. So, and as I mentioned, I'm Heinrich Dietz, and I have the pleasure to give you a very short introduction to this event. On our website, you can look at installation views of Ester's show at the Kunstverein of Slow Tools. So maybe just one or two sentences as a very extremely short introduction about Ester's practice. So Ester's artistic practice develops in the intersection of three domains. Fleckner works predominantly with woodcut or woodcuts, and their work is characterized by an abstract visual language. So that would be the second one. And the third one is that Ester is working from queer perspectives. So this means that Ester we have a very material and physical practice, woodcutting, from which Ester Fleckner approaches the field of queer abstraction. So very short introduction about queer abstraction. So representation and figuration can be important strategies to create visibility, to form alliances, and to pursue political goals. However, it is also important to insist on the illegibility and openness of queerness. And this is probably one of the reasons, or one of the potentials of abstraction, and one of the reasons why queer artists have turned to abstraction as a visual strategy. So there has been a continuous discourse about queer abstraction in the last decades, and this discourse has gained even more momentum in the last few years. And from a scholarly or theoretical side, one of the most recent and in-depth contributions to this field of queer abstraction is Lex Morgan Lancaster's book, Dragging Away Queer Abstraction in Contemporary Art, which was published about 1 year ago by Duke University Press. And this is, by the way, also the first monograph on queer abstraction, or more precisely, on practices of queer abstraction. Lex Morgan Lancaster is an art historian and curator who focuses on queer, trans, anti-racist, and crip contributions to the field of contemporary art, and they are currently working as an assistant professor of art history at the Cooper Union in New York. And I won't give you an introduction to Lex's amazing book, because this is something that Lex will do, but just let me mention like one little thing. Lex's book has been really extremely inspiring while I was working on Ester's exhibition, and also for the conversations Ester and me had. So yeah, I'm therefore really happy that Lex is joining us for this event today, and then there will also be a discussion or conversation between Ester and Lex after Lex's short introduction. So let's just start. Lex, I'm really glad you are joining us, and I give over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I will share my PowerPoint. This is my first international event, and I'm really happy. My expertise has been primarily thus far in US-based art practices, and seeing how my book and scholarship has resonated for artists in Europe has just continues to thrill me. So I'm so grateful for this conversation. So I have a couple of aims for my short talk today. First, I want to introduce the term queer abstraction and consider what's at stake in taking abstraction seriously as a queer tactic in art. And then I'll discuss a few examples to demonstrate how I see abstraction operating queerly and focusing specifically on geometric abstraction and the grid, because those are really relevant to Ester's practice. So abstraction is now considered a major force in contemporary queer art practices, as artists who are invested in politics of gender, sexuality, and race are utilizing abstract formal and material strategies rather than straightforward representations of identity. So to begin, abstraction defies some of the expectations we bring to queer art and the expectations we bring to political art more broadly. So one way into this topic is to think with art practices that exploded in the early 90s in the wake of the AIDS crisis and the culture wars, particularly in New York City. The art collectives Fierce Pussy and Dyke Action Machine, as you see here, used very direct language and images to generate queer feminist politics. Just going to see if I can move this. Yeah, there we go. Get that out of the way. So basically the term queer art, right, it conjures images of people, eroticism, and communities. We expect didactic political work. This field has been defined by representation. It was through strategic visibility politics that queer artists fought for rights and recognition. These lesbian art collectives wheat pasted their Xerox posters all over New York City on billboards, reclaiming the language used for anti-queer violence. These pejoratives may abstract people into concepts like dykes, but they reroute the violence of that abstraction toward a language of pleasure and even pride. The strategy of taking on and torquing the forms and languages that have harmed, forms that are seemingly not for us as queers, aligns with the tactics of queer abstraction that are similarly not about rejecting difficulty, but working in and through the very things with which we have a vexed relationship. The core members of Fierce Pussy, including Joy Episala and the co-founder of Dyke Action Machine, Carrie Moyer, also make abstract work. Episala's photogram on the left here are sheets of photographic paper on a monumental scale with cracks and ripples from handling and exposure. Moyer's paintings recall both color field and the mess of gestural abstraction, often incorporating glitter. My book was driven by the question of what we should make of these practices that defy the expectation that queer artists should transparently represent themselves in their work. How can work that does not directly represent a figure or a body operate queerly? How does abstraction resonate socially and politically if what we're experiencing cannot be described in representational terms? How can such illegibility make other kinds of things, if not legible, then felt, palpable in more haptic and intimate ways? Queer is generally understood to describe non-normative sexualities, identities, and communities, but my use of the term is more in line with queer theory's understanding of queer as a verb that works as an active challenge to norms of gender and sex, as in queering. And I'm thinking frequently with scholars like Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, Jose Munoz, Sarah Ahmed, scholars who've helped us to imagine what queer can do beyond a singular identity to engage us more affectively and relationally. I use the term affect a lot, and by this I mean a kind of encounter that moves us, that we feel both emotionally and somatically in our bodies. Affect also describes ways of being in relation to others. So rather than attach queer to a subject matter, I'm asking how this artwork queers by challenging the stability of representation itself and challenging us in other ways, as this work often prompts intimate encounters and demands a certain vulnerability on our part. Accordingly, my understanding of queer abstraction isn't about the artist's identities. My methods aren't biographical, but it does proceed from an awareness of their artistic practices and political investments. So on the one hand, I'm asking how and why abstraction is useful for queer and politically engaged artists. And on the other, I argue that abstraction queers through visual and material tactics that defy legibility. This refusal of direct representation is precisely why abstraction is politically relevant. It refuses the surveilling demand that we appear as expected in the form of predetermined categories, and shows that queering can operate as an aesthetic innovation and politics of form and matter. So my queer formalist and materialist methodology is dedicated to expanding how we think queering works and how we think art works in relation to politics. My book argues that abstraction is not a fixed image or style in any particular medium, but visual and material processes or actions that determine that undermine legibility, categorization, and shift our perspectives along with the assumptions we bring to the act of looking. I use drag to describe these fugitive processes of queering. My book's title is Dragging Away, just taken from the origins of the term abstract, from the Latin meaning to draw, pull, or drag away. Queer abstraction drags in multiple aesthetic, material, historical, and political ways as a pulling force or friction that impedes or obstructs, a temporal slowing down, a pull of the past on the present, a performative troubling of surface categories, a resistance, and a difficult labor. I make three main arguments about queer abstraction as a kind of drag: that it drags on certain histories of abstract form tied to modernism, that it drags away from straightforward legibility and undermines harmful representational logics, and that it drags us into sensual and embodied forms of engagement, producing queer encounters. To investigate these multiple operations of drag, my book stages transhistorical conversations between contemporary works and certain forms of modernist abstraction that they recite and reimagine. So the two I'll highlight here are the hard edge and the grid. So this is one conversation between the work of Nancy Brooks Brody and the shaped monochrome hard edge paintings of Ellsworth Kelly. I consider how Brody's color forms queer geometric abstraction, and particularly the form of the hard edge. But I'm also reckoning with the difficulty of queer abstraction, which drags on the harmful histories of the forms it uses, forging new possibilities while not letting go or disavowing that difficulty. And I build on Jose Munoz's concept of disidentification to explore this queer attachment to things that would not seem to be for us, aesthetics and materials that have a lot of baggage. So I couldn't investigate the form of the hard edge in Brody's work, for example, without considering all of its historical weight as an anti-expressive strategy and how that gets carried into the present defiantly through Brody's insistence on the wavering edge and sensual undulating surface of her enamel color forms. These are very small. I could hold them in the palm of my hand. So they're much more intimate in scale than Kelly's monumental canvases, and their haptic qualities more readily elicit queer sensibilities. Geometric forms such as Kelly's have often been read according to a signifying logic, as though they're abstracted images. And in general, abstract forms in the work of queer artists are taken as abstracted references to bodies or the edges of bodies often. But rather than read them as figurative references or signs, we can make more space for the contingency of unruly material encounters that drag away from an easy signification. The danger of a signifying logic has a particular relationship to geometry. Think of the pink triangle, once used as a sign of stigma to mark queers for death. A symbol used to mark a subject as an abstraction can do harm, but it has also been redeployed in the service of queer politics by ACT UP to hold on to that harm while also converting its power for collective action. Queer abstraction is often ambivalent. It has mixed feelings, and that it holds on to the difficulty of the forms that it's redeploying while reimagining them in the service of alternative futures. These are photos that I took of Brody's work that might help you see what it looks like from far away and up close. This encounter does not involve a reading of edges as bodily contours. You wouldn't engage them at the scale of a body because of their intimate size. Rather, we imagine how they might feel to touch, the visceral contact between warm skin and a cool, hardened surface that seems like it might still be fluid. They shine, their surfaces undulate. The line of contact between the enamel support and the white sheetrock produces a palpable tension. The objects never quite fit. Brody's edging suggests an eroticism and a practice of care through close attention to boundaries, carefully etching into the gallery wall to make space for these small objects. This intimate encounter produces a relationality that is queer and also unspecified. Their boundaries don't fix a figure, but suggest that figure and ground mutually shape one another, the ways in which subjects orient and are oriented by their environment. These works can still prompt a queer eroticism without settling into bodily legibility. If there's a body involved in this encounter, it's not one that is represented, but my own immediate presence. I begin to feel precarious in relation to my surroundings, my boundaries as insecure as these color forms that still look wet and threaten to flow out over their borders. To queer abstraction is in part to expose and reroute its power from a neutralizing and potentially violent erasure to a method for refusing fixity and materializing difference in unexpected ways. In work like Brody's, we feel the drag of abstract forms that are never really neutral or transcendent. Geometry might not be an outdated utopian aesthetic strategy after all. Its critique of representational pictorial convention is still useful. Materiality is central to my queer formalism because the haptic qualities and thick textures of much of this work demand more intimate forms of spectatorship. It resonates affectively and also engages with the fraught histories of certain materials that are marked by their own gendered, sexed, racialized, and classed dynamics. So now I'm going to pivot a bit to talk about the grid, another kind of geometric system that has been used to mark bodies according to predetermined codes. I've written about Lorna Simpson's Public Sex series, these large photographs printed on thick felt panels, to argue that the grid can both shore up technologies of bodily surveillance while also creating intimate vectors for queer relationality and for exceeding the grid's own oppressive logic. The grid is also, of course, an iconic form of modernism, a structure that mapped the literal surface of the canvas, as in the painting of Agnes Martin, and also claimed the kind of purity and universality that's associated with geometric abstraction more broadly. The grid also has a complex history, and Simpson's work notably combines photography with gridded systems that have historically produced oppressive taxonomies. They were called the photographic documents used to justify eugenics in the 19th and early 20th century that often placed physical types together in gridded patterns to create comparison and to produce to produce bodies as raced and deviant. There's a danger in this form of the grid that fixes and regulates its subjects. It's a structure that can make bodies hyper visible and legible as other. Lorna Simpson's work also exemplifies my more expansive understanding of queer abstraction, which is not necessarily always produced by queer identified artists and not necessarily non-representational. Simpson's practice contributes to contestatory gender and sexual politics, and her work often invokes queer content, especially in this series, as you'll see. So this is a photograph of a city park at night, blown up and screen printed onto a large grid of 6 felt panels. It measures about 5.5 feet on either side, so we could almost walk into the scene. Our perspective is destabilized as we look down through the small forest of trees at a clearing of grass, a walking path. Rows of buildings create an expansive grid of windows that echoes the larger gridded structure. And this image is flanked by 2 narrative panels printed on felt. So to the left, it says, just unpacked a new shiny silver telescope, and we are up high enough for a really good view of all the buildings and the park. The living room window seems to be the best spot for it. On the sidewalk below, a man watches figures from across the path. And to the right, it is early evening. The lone sociologist walks through the park to observe private acts in the men's public bathrooms. These facilities are men's and women's rooms back to back. He focuses on the layout of the men's room, right to left, basin, urinal, 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 stall, stall. He decides to adopt the role of voyeur and lookout in order to go unnoticed and noticed at the same time. His research takes several years. He names his subjects A, B, C, X, Y, and O, records their activities for now and their license plates when applicable for later. This is one work in Simpson's Public Sex series where pictures of uninhabited places become the implied locations of sexual and voyeuristic acts described in narrative text, but which we never see. In the context of the park, the grid enables certain forms of relationality that I understand to do queer work. Relationality refers to a being in common with others, or a kind of affinity that moves beyond the individual subject, as articulated by Jean-Luc Nancy. And this contact across the bounds of difference is what Jose Munoz has called incommensurate, as it is incalculable and excessive, but also shared through proximity. This is a particularly queer form of relationality that allows us to be in common in difference, and I consider the crisscrossing lines of the grid to create that kind of relational space of both commons and separation. This felt grid becomes a cruising site for what remains unrepresented and unresolved, yet shared or public through imaginative projections and events in which we, the spectator, are implicated. The text points to what is not seen in the image, but what still tempts and teases us with indirect reference to a space of intimacy. Not only do the narratives in the park reference the gay cruising sites of public parks and men's restrooms and the voyeurs who observe them, but the gridded image further references the grid's ambivalent capacity for both surveillance and association, made sensual through the texture of felt. It refers to and disallows the gaze that fixes certain subjects as other, but it keeps the eroticism of the grid in play, especially through the particular materiality of felt. Unlike a canvas, which is a gridded textile, felt is made of compressed fibers that interact more randomly. Felt evokes both a tactile sensation of touch and an affective sensation, a feeling. This materiality produces a picture plane that is not the ground of representation, but becomes a bushy and unruly site of contact. This is one way in which it refuses the force of the grid to settle bodies and spaces, and instead uses the felt to connect affect with materiality and produce relational textures of feeling. I put Simpson's grids in contact with Agnes Martin's paintings to consider the excessive capacities of the grid, their capacity to exceed the force of surveilling logic. These two are close in scale, large and looming at about 6 feet. They relate directly to the body of the viewer as a landscape one could enter, and at the same time, their gridded surfaces bar us from getting too caught up in illusory depth. They call attention to their surfaces as material planes on which a picture is both rendered and abstracted. Like Simpson's titles, Martin's tend to reference nature or landscape. Yet they create a boundless geography of coordinates that exceed two-dimensional mapping. If we pay attention to how the lines of the grid extend infinitely in space and suggest an infinite temporality, the excessive material dimensions of Simpson's felt and Martin's repetitive patterns and the vibratory effects of figure ground oscillation troubles a settled reference or even a settled point of reference. The titles seem to specify what the picture cannot secure, and the grid is shown to exceed itself. Even as it holds on to a potential surveilling power, it can make space for other things to happen. In both works, the grid emerges as an emphatically sensual form, and its textures can disrupt its regularity or cold austerity in favor of a more touchy-feely abstraction. The grid is not simply a background framework, but is rather an active, materializing force. This is a good place to start to shift and talk with Ester a little bit more. But I'll say that overall, the ambition of my scholarship is to expand our understanding of what counts as social and political art and how we interpret it by showing that formal and material tactics can be cultural, social, and political as much as any iconography. Shifting how we think art works in relation to identity and politics has real ethical implications for how we view and engage with others in the world. Queer abstractions refuse these terms as categories we project onto others and instead operate as possibilities for sensing differently, for working in and through troubling aesthetic and material histories, and for relating across difference. Paying closer attention to what it feels like to be with this work then can produce queer experiences.
It would be super interesting to start the conversation to talk about materiality, as much abstract work is like materiality is very present and a core part of what is at stake and what we analyze from. So I think my first question would be also to hear if you or how you think the artistic methods or work process and as well as the material matters to your reading of works. If you can talk more about that. I know that sometimes the process itself is less available or obvious. In my own experience, the political and queer aspects can sometimes be embedded in the making of the work or the process, testing and trying, as well as in the result. So yeah, I would be curious to hear if you have thoughts about that. But also just how, the materials, how you think about that.
I similarly, process is important to be. Materiality is pretty central to my the queer readings that I generate from the work or as I'm thinking with the work, which is why I kind of insist not just on saying formal analysis, but formal and material analysis. I'm interested in material processes, like how things are made or how they come into being. I think in part because I'm invested in things not being settled. So when we talk about something like style, it often seems like this stable or kind of singular thing, but queer approaches value the doing as a kind of queering, right? And looking to can be queering, but then the making and the reading of the work can be an interesting conversation. Right. So this is why I insist on queer abstraction as a process rather than a kind of style, which would seem too stabilizing. It matters to me, for example, that your gridded works are often like hand cut and printed versus painted, right? Like the relationship between hand and tools is different. The wavering produced by a handmade process is, is important. And I think the fact that the final work shows evidence of the making as well, that it's not seemingly perfect or sort of mechanical, it's much more intimate. That material relationship is important for how we perceive it and read it. And in some ways, there are ways that the final process shows up in the kind of repetitive act that then produces a multiplicity. Sometimes, the making of the work might not be so available to viewers or to every viewer, depending on how much they know about artistic process. But that's such an important part of, and I'm very lucky to work, to think with artists who are still living for this reason, because I get to do studio visits and ask people probably gets to be annoying questions about how people made things. But it becomes an important, it becomes, to me, that's such an important part of context, right? And art historians always kind of think about the work as a product of its context. And I don't necessarily always securely attach a work to, the very year in which it was made. I mean, I think things are a bit more temporally fluid than that for me. I have a queer relationship with history, but for me, the context that I do get attached to is the material production of the thing. That's, really kind of essential for me. So yeah, I mean, I would love to hear more, Liv, hear you talk a little bit more about your use of the woodcut, as a medium and your material process.
Because thanks. I can really relate to what you say, and I think that especially developing methods and process is a big part of my practice, and also something I think about through queer theory, and something that it inspires me to think about how I work and with what materials I work with. Woodcut is central in my work and something I've been working with continuously for 10 years. And I'm very drawn to it for several reasons. It's a great media for staying open and somehow slightly out of control in the process, I would say, and it helps me to arrive with a more abstract aesthetics that I find interesting, which I will come back to also. But the cutting as well as the printing process is slow and physical, and really allows for unpredictability and errors that appear. So there's really a feeling of working with unknowns. And the materiality itself, it gives me a sense of intimacy with the plate, and the cutted lines are rough and blurry and quite different from my drawing sketches that are often my starting point. So there's a kind of transfer between drawing and then continuing with the wood after. Working with wood is completely intertwined with my interest in working from queer perspective. So it's also why I am working with seriality and repetition as a really ongoing method or approach in my practice. And that is for example, because I like to work with the terms movement and failure, refusal, and the unfinished. And that are terms that I'm thinking about in relation to queerness. and that has inspired me to explore different ways of working with the woodcut, and the printing as a medium is really good to work with these terms. So instead of aiming to make one final perfect plate from which I can make additions, I have much more an interest of trying to change the plate along the way. And that could be by cutting again and again in between each print. And it could be, which is also in the series Woodbed Brimming that I'm showing at the Kunstverein Freiburg. And where the repetition is also central to this series. So these are the big blue prints on the left side, where I have kind of reused again and again on the plates, and making the composition a kind of more wild and chaotic in that process. I think repetition is really crucial to think about, because it's central to the production of categories and social implementation of gender norms that Butler theorizes. So in many ways, repetition can be very frightening, but it can also have the potential to enable openness and questions, and that's what I try to work with, in a way where my repetitions have a more kind of destabilizing characteristic. So I kind of have a starting point in this series. They are made of very basic geometric figures like triangles and pentagons. So figures that we know from elsewhere, and that I put in this different context and in this work it through the hand and in the media of woodcut, and in a composition where I'm trying to ask back what is it we know about geometry, and what is it is doing to the body, and try to know, or it's used to enforce power on the body in different contexts. So seriality and repetition are really central for me, and something that is ongoing in most of my series. I think that I find interesting with seriality is also to try to enable these connections or even communities between the works. So it's really a thing that I think about, that each work I can think of as an attempt or as a suggestion of one way of making the piece, and then I can try again, and it has a different outcome. So there is this concept of trying again over and over, also as a kind of performative way of working. And in the end, when I have the series, I'm very interested in the collective body between them as much as I am in the individual piece, so to speak. So there is really this interest also in the individual in relation to the collective, in a way, in relation to the series and the repetition, that could have many kind of other layers of thinking into that. I think maybe that's.
I wonder too about one of my favorite features about these is the way that some of the lines will extend, like some of the little shape, the little triangles will sort of they don't just all stay. There you go. Yeah, they don't just like all stay right in this like perfect alignment. Some of them like keep extending. Some of them on the top of the bottom, there'll be just like a few, you know, at the bottom or the top. And that's so interesting to me. I mean, because I was, you know, just talking about like ideas about excess, right? And I think that it points us to how that kind of repetitive practice can move beyond certain constraints too, right? That it can exceed boundaries. And so, yeah, that seems relevant.
Yeah, exactly. That I kind of have a concept or framework that I start from, but then I not only allow myself to make differences, I from the beginning I seek to just move away from the concept and add more layers to have this kind of more conflicting image also, or yeah, escaping or failing the concept, or also yeah, maybe adding some kind of humorous comment even to this strict repetition that is at the same time very strict. So there is a kind of playing with these frameworks I'm giving myself.
I was also struck by what you were saying about you know, how geometry can assert, you know, power on the body in oppressive ways, and how, you know, repetition, right, is central to the ways in which Butler theorizes gender does us, right, in all of these ways. And so, you know, for me, I'm often thinking about how or I'm interested in a queer attachment to these or in queer attachment generally, but in like, you know, this whole project started with like how can abstraction be useful or interesting for queer artists? Like, why would abstraction of all things become such an important tool for contemporary queer artists? And so I'm wondering if we can kind of parse a little bit that the question of how and why abstract visual languages and models are turned out to be useful for you as a queer artist, an artist invested in queer politics. Are there things that also remain unresolved, right? These things that are potentially very harmful then you know, get redeployed. If there are ways that, you know, you think about that kind of love-hate relationship, I guess, with the tools and the strategies you're using.
Yeah, it is a conflict in a way for me to engage with geometry, or yeah, as I told you in an earlier conversation, that I have a kind of love-hate relation to geometry, which is of course, or not of course, but it's because that yeah, geometry works to it's a specific mathematic system that has it works in many different contexts, but also used to kind of measure people, measure spaces. It's everywhere in our architecture where we navigate to direct the body in different ways. So it really has a huge impact on our lives and our way of considering also the body and the yeah, how to look and the size and length and function of bodies. And at the same time, I think geometry has a kind of openness in the sense that it's also abstract forms that has in itself an openness to think beyond the direct representation that can also be puzzle for me, because thinking about from queer theory, the term queer and queerness are really open terms and not about defining, but more about questioning definitions, and asking back. So what is really central for me in my practice is to try to investigate how can I also ask back, and for doing that, criticizing back or even refusing certain categories or binary thinking. I think abstraction is interesting to make images that doesn't give answer, but that are also more open, or kind of shaking what we think we know about something. It could be about geometry, or about symmetry, or language. I'm also deeply inspired by Butler's theory on language and performativity, and many of my work has this mimicry of language in them, kind of playing with making other kinds of languages, but also kind of collapsing the different figures or signs that I write with, that we maybe recognize from elsewhere, but they kind of lose their meaning when used through endless repetition, and in a different way, where their meaning is open again. So I think abstraction is interesting in many levels, that it can both help us unfold queer representation in a more open and a more broad way, also relating to emotions, desires, relations, and not just direct representation of a body or sex. So it can touch on different aspects also of queerness, but then at the same time, which is just as important for me, is this kind of turning the gaze and questioning back to the matrix, or to the norm. So for me, that's kind of a double interest in my practice to unfold, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, there's a reclaiming, right? There are the things that are supposedly very kind of seemingly very neutral, and especially about abstraction, that claims really no direct reference to an image or a narrative in the world, in a kind of representational way, that other things kind of unfold through that, and also that those tools can also be ours, right? That the kind of the normative matrix doesn't get to claim everything. Like you don't get to own like nature, for example. You don't get to kind of I think taking back those kinds of tools, or reclaiming tools and forms, is so important to queer practice and abstraction, when we're dealing with abstraction specifically. But yeah, I think thinking about language, and sign systems, it seems like, language always falls short. It's just that abstraction makes that really obvious, right? Like, I talk about, or I thought a lot about, in kind of, and still think a lot about, how language falls short, or like language fails me in my efforts to describe abstraction, or like to talk, like talking about abstraction is actually really challenging. But we should always be so challenged in how we attempt to describe something or someone, right? There's often a kind of like excess in relation to uses of language that you know, we think of as this sort of precisely encoded thing, and yet it's not, right? And so I think the ways that abstraction troubles language is can be really useful, and that also, as you were saying, comes out in your work.
But also the other part of your question before, like the kind of limitations to abstraction is also like relevant to think about, and how yeah, not only language is failing, but we also, I think it's really, yeah, we can't say everything through abstraction nor language. We also need direct representation, like, and we also so yeah, I think what I try to do in some of my works, one thing is that I draw on some of my prints. I also add sometimes fragmented text in the margins, and as a kind of conversation even with my prints. Or I try to make titles that can invite viewers into the works, which can both be really helpful for making a work and allow it to be even more abstract if I have a kind of title that can help thinking into something that can open up the work, perhaps. But I think, like with your book and this term dragging away is also really like helpful and poetic in the way it can be used to open up works and make new connections. So I think yeah, there are kind of influences forth and back, I think, between both theory and abstraction, and the language we also need to speak. Like we also have to accept that we must also speak and communicate, and sometimes failing it, and sometimes trying to speak in different ways. And for me, abstraction can somehow help with that, but at the same time, it's also a process where it's the works can also speak another language, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be translated. It doesn't have to, but we can address what it touches on us, perhaps, or in us.
Yeah, there can be, like, it can point to like what can't be articulated or represented, but it can still suggest. And those suggestions can take different people in different places, which I think is also, there's an understanding of the subjectivity of spectatorship, right? And like a certain, like, it really demands active spectatorship. And you know, it functions differently, and it challenges us in a lot of ways, and that challenge can also be like really politically useful, and it can also create this like encounter that has so much more like texture to it, or is very sensual. So, you know, there's queer art that depicts queer sex, and there's queer art that like maybe feels a little bit more like queer sex, but doesn't depict it, you know?
Totally.
Yeah, but we need all the tools, right? Like we need all of the possible kind of aesthetic tools available to us in order to make a more just world, right? And so, yeah, we can sort of be in conversation. Representation and abstraction can be in tension and in conversation, and that can also be really generative.
Absolutely.